Together. All right, so let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Cool. Welcome to our webinars. Idea here is we used to do Dub Better, but now we want to put a little bit more professional content out there that's a bit more geared towards the audience that we speak to. And in particular, the first one that we came up with was to talk about something that I've had some challenges with, both myself and also seen other organizations have challenges with through the years, and that's to scale outcomes and not just teams. And there's a lot of buzzwords in that statement. What does it mean to scale outcomes? Right? When I have a big initiative or a big problem that I need to solve in my business, the first thing I do is reach for a few tools that I have as an organization, depending on the size. And oftentimes that's hiring and building larger teams to align to bigger work streams. But one of the things we've noticed a pattern, if you will, is that it's not always about scaling your organization. And there's a few pitfalls in just adding additional headcount that we want to talk through today. So let's just kind of go through what is the philosophy for scaling outcomes? What do I mean by that? That's a big buzzword. I'm sure everybody wants to scale outcomes. A lot of organizations want to align to outcomes instead of to simple velocity. And we're going to talk through that. Drink of water here. So the first and probably most interesting and obvious point is, or least interesting and most obvious point, is that growth doesn't have to mean that we're running 5,000 miles per hour and adding headcount with reckless abandon or adding additional work streams with reckless abandon. That can be done a bit more thoughtfully, as you would expect. This is a fairly obvious point, but I want to dig into the details of that because it is quite difficult, even though it's obvious. It is quite difficult to resist the urge to simply go into this deep, dark hole of busyness and finding as many humans as you possibly can to throw against this problem, this big initiative or challenge that your business is running into. The second bit, and we're going to talk about organizational structure a little bit and process. The wrong structure and the wrong incentive set will break your team's stride pretty hard. This is also fairly obvious, but a fairly easy trap for people to fall into if you sort of do it the way that you've always done it, or you don't raise your head above water for a moment to look around and try and understand exactly what's going on at the meta level, right? When you're sort of paralyzed by the tactics that you need to put in place. I want to explore a model that we put together to enable high output organizations. This is nothing I'm going to write a book over. This is just some simple observations on what does it mean to align your organization, similar to some of the other frameworks you've seen. There's agile, there's PMP, the iron triangle. There's all various ways to sort of prop up your organization. And there are plenty of metrics and framework systems like OKRs that have been built around producing some kind of telemetry around this. But I don't want to really dig too deep into that. I want to talk instead about at the meta level, at that 50,000 foot level. How do you think about structure and teams and Conway's law and stuff like that? And then finally, I put together just a really simple set of questions that we can think about. Again, this is not designed to be a McKinsey framework. This is a free webinar, not a $500,000 PowerPoint deck. I assure you, I did not spend that much time on this particular deck. But there are some pretty deep questions that you want to ask yourself and your leadership team, and perhaps even yourself if you are a founder or perhaps you're a very small and tight team. There are a few questions you want to ask yourself to validate. Are we doing the right thing? Are we pushing hard against the right ideas, and are we building the right contexts in our teams? So let's talk first. So when I'm scaling, what breaks first? There are a few specific items that break first whenever you're trying to just jump into some form of scaling event. And I like the metaphor of just adding lanes to a traffic jam. If the flow is broken, then more cars just means more gridlocks. One of the first things we see to break is clarity. No one's really sure what success looks like because success is now this incredibly, immensely broad idea. We've added 5 new work streams. We've added a brand new business unit. We've done M&A and purchased this other company that's a totally different business unit that's strategically relevant to what we're doing, but not necessarily the same. So now no one has any clarity. M&A is a pretty tough space for this, I would say. And M&A, one of the very first things to break is clarity. And we can come up with all of the corporate sort of buzz, corporate boardroom buzzwords and spend time talking about culture and do icebreakers, et cetera. But none of that truly solves for the clarity point, because if you don't already have clarity in what you're trying to do, it's nearly impossible to bring clarity to another initiative, right? So what does it mean to think through clarity? Typically that is, again, a very poignant idea on what is the reason that we're undertaking this new work, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about tactics. But strategically, how do I make sure that I, at the top, if I am an executive or a VP, how am I communicating to the folks, the middle management, the people that are more or less the MVPs of this, the folks that will be championing these ideas? How do I communicate to them, this is what I'm trying to achieve, right? As a business, this is our goal. And a lot of the times we're a bit too vague on that, especially if your managers are more tactical. I'm an engineer, right? I came from writing software, so tactics are all I know. So strategy becomes a little bit more difficult as you sort of ascend into the upper echelons of management. And these types of people like me tend to over communicate tactics, whereas folks that have a little bit less tangible, maybe you are a more strategic person, or you've spent more of your career in business strategy, it's a little bit harder for you to dictate those tactics, or to ground your strategy in those tactics, and to build that clarity and that sort of clairvoyance around what are we trying to achieve with this work stream, with this particular set of ideas, with this M&A, with this purchase that we're making. So it's important to think that through. Consistency is another thing that tends to break, and these two things are kind of linked. Consistency is, the engineering organization. I'm going to use that because that's what I'm is most relevant to me. Engineering organizations have very specific processes that we follow. They're not all great, but most of them do bring some form of consistency to delivery. And whenever whenever you scale your organization, one of the first things to break is that consistency. You have new headcount, you have new initiatives, you have new leadership. Maybe you've refactored an existing R&D team or an existing delivery team into an R&D team, and they're empowered to go and do crazy things, and the rest of your organization are looking at them with extreme jealousy and saying, well, why can't we have that level of freedom? And that consistency can be difficult, because communication, that consistency breaking can be difficult because it degrades communication pretty quickly. It makes it harder to deliver, and it also makes it harder to bring people into the organization if you have no consistent message on how they're supposed to, build their development environment or stand up, their ticket delivery process, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, probably the most paralyzing, honestly, is that decision velocity is going to break. Without clarity and the right support, your middle management is going to be completely overwhelmed, and that's going to slow down decisions that typically are distributed. You're hiring new people in, so it's less likely for you, and this is a totally fair and reasonable thought process. It's less likely for you to delegate decisions to people that are brand new to the organization without some form of check valve, right? Some form of trust but verify in place. So that's difficult, and you want to make sure that you maintain decision velocity in some way. And the way, again, the framework that I use there is trust but verify. Like, especially if you're hiring in middle management or upper management, you have no choice but to trust them. But if you're bringing in engineering talent, if you're bringing in on the ground, boots on the ground people, headcount to execute, that's where making sure you have the appropriate delegation framework and the appropriate trust framework in place on the ground, which we'll talk about in a minute, is extremely important. My personal experience with this is that I had to scale my business in 2022. We went from, I think, around 18 to 20 people to 40. So we doubled. And for myself, being the only person in that seat and the only person that trusted myself, and this was foolish, by the way, to hire the right people, I was wall-to-wall calendar interviews for literally almost 5.5 weeks, and it broke me. By October, my brain had just simply snapped, and I was numb to all emotions because I was so incredibly burned out. Now, we made it. I survived, but a lot of the things I learned from that is that it's not all about headcount, which we'll talk about. An underlying theme of this presentation, as we dig further, you'll find, is doing less with more. But it's not all about headcount, but it's also about ensuring you have the right process. I would say, what are the good things that came out of that scaling event for us, for our company, is that we perfected our interviewing process. And by perfected, I mean at the time we figured out how to do it well. There is really no perfected interview process, but we worked really, really hard to sort out what's the best way to find the best talent. And of the people during that 20-person scaling event, I would say likely 75 to 80% of them are still with the company. You're never going to get it right 100%. But I ran into every one of these issues. Now, granted, we're a consulting business, so consistency and clarity is pretty straightforward, right? Do the best work you possibly can for your customers, and ensuring that we align all our core values in the 7 factors and align all of our ideologies to that is fairly straightforward as long as the management team is in sync with it. Consistency was definitely a challenge there, just because these people are going to different clients and they have to be adaptable and understand that nothing is going to be consistent. We had a terrible onboarding process, which was literally me getting on a phone call with them and just talking them through, hey, welcome to the company. Good luck, have fun, right? And communication certainly degraded pretty quickly throughout my leadership team, despite them being great. There was lots of new customers, lots of new initiatives, lots of new challenges and problems and fire drills that I had to support through that time. So that was a very clean and clear example to me that I did not stand my organization up for scaling, despite the fact that I just thought, you know what, I'll figure it out as I go. And from that, I learned that it is very important to think these ideas through. Don't become, again, analysis paralysis, but certainly think through what are some key points in my organization that I can think about that will help me when I have some form of scaling event or some giant group of work that I have to push out the other side. I think that couple of interesting points for you here. Some statistics that research from McKinsey shows that 70% of digital transformation initiatives fail, and it's often because middle management is under supported or excluded from strategy alignment. So this goes back to clarity. And also consistency and decision velocity. If you're middle management, which honestly, frankly, I'm looking at y'all are extremely important to scaling, and I think that middle management is oftentimes underutilized and underthanked for this type of thing. It's very important to enable these folks to make the right decisions on the ground, which we'll talk about here in a minute. A 2022 Harvard Business Review study found that only 35% of middle managers feel like they have the tools and authority to implement change effectively during periods of organizational growth. That's a really interesting idea to think through. And often middle managers account for 22% of organizational productivity loss due to misalignment and decision lag. That comes from a Gartner study in 2023. So these three sort of facts underscore the concept of clarity, consistency, decision velocity, and delegating this to the right people, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Obviously, delegation is very important when you're scaling. But I want us to keep those ideas in our brain as we move forward, that a lot of the pillars of scale stand on your middle management and how they are treated and how they are enabled. One brief point here is AI. There will be a point where we talk in the presentation about AI and it allowing sort of smaller, leaner teams doing less with more, et cetera. But I'm sure since that's the buzzword of the year, it's important to think about how does that in fact scale your organization. And we're not sure yet. I just want to go on record there. There's a lot of stuff you're seeing probably on the internet and out there in the business sphere that some teams are getting X% productivity increases through utilizing co-pilots or agentic AI or things like that. AI is a phenomenal tool, and it is when used correctly a force multiplier. But I want just to be careful to not view it as a silver bullet and overcommit to a technology that's still emerging, that doesn't have a whole lot of legislation around it. There's lots of questions about copywriting and licensing models, et cetera, that need to be solved before it's a fully sort of functional thing for us to lean into. But with that being said, let's think about how we scale, right? And so something that you've probably heard of and remember is the iron triangle from PMP. If there's anyone watching this that knows what that is. It's time, scope, and cost. I remember when I joined a consulting firm early in my career, sort of journeyman stage in my career. I worked with my first project manager that was very PMP enabled. She was awesome. We became frenemies very fast because I was a developer that was used to working and just breaking things the way we worked at Microsoft back in the Ballmer days, and walked into a much more organized and more what's the word, telemetry, a lot more telemetry across what I was doing, and it was very interesting to me and frustrating in ways. But she and I are best friends now, but back then we were definitely frenemies. So the classic iron triangle talks about time, scope, and cost, right? And there are really three levers you think about when you build your Gantt chart: is how much time is something going to take, what's the scope over time, and then what's the cost. And these three components of this triangle more or less create some telemetry and some ideas that you can use to manage projects, right? If this project's going to take 6 weeks, it's going to consume scope equal to X, which is either a waterfall document back in the day or some agile-esque waterfall type sprint backlog with story and velocity points, the way we think of it today. And how much is it going to cost? And those things are used to manage those projects and to deliver outcomes. The execution of an iron triangle type approach is you get outcomes on the other side of the business, which hopefully is tied back to revenue or some form of OKR or something in your business that you can think of as this is actually producing value, right, for the organization that we work in. So the way that I've sort of retooled this, and again, I'm not trying to write a book or invent anything new, is I really think of it as organizational gravity. And we're going to talk about Conway's Law here for a minute. So Conway's Law states, and I quote, and I'm going to read this or I'm going to get it wrong: organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations, which explains why your system quality is often a reflection of your org chart. Conway's Law has been around for a while. There's been some great books written on it. If you've read the Phoenix Project, you're probably very aware of Conway's Law and how everything sort of stands itself up around just in time around the organizational structure that you have. I'm completely fine with this. I think this is normal, but I do think that this can cause some pretty serious challenges in your organization if your organization is simply designed to be HR headcount related, right? Where person X is assigned to manager Y, and manager Y has duties Z, and then that in turn produces some set of features. We found that that works for some very minimalistic business domains, but when you get to more complex business domains like software and SaaS products, it gets a little bit harder to truly you think of Conway's Law as producing a framework that's natural for delivering software or delivering widgets at a decent time frame. So when we talk about gravity, what I mean by this is that alignment and infrastructure, they pull teams toward outcomes, right? And this is the lens we're going to use for the rest of this. So outcomes are ultimately what a business is looking for, right? If you talk to the CEO, if you talk to me and you ask me, what do I want? I want teams that are executing for clients in the very best way possible. I want them to be empowered. I want them to challenge customers, and I want them to deliver against timelines and deadlines as appropriate. Those are the measurable business outcomes and strategic processes that produce value in my organization. Notice I did not say I want more revenue or I want more profit. Those are byproducts of the strategy. Those are byproducts of the outcomes that I'm looking for. And I've always held this view: if I deliver good software to my customers, I will get the outcome of them hiring me again, right? It may not be now because there could be budget constraints or other issues, but I will get additional work, or they will refer me to someone in their network that wants work like what I produced. That is an outcome. That is a business outcome. It is not, revenue is not a business outcome. It is, but it's not a good one, in my opinion. I think it's, revenue as an outcome is left to the boardrooms of billion-dollar companies, which is totally fine. I'm a capitalist. I have no problems with this, but that doesn't get you to at the organization level that I'm talking about. It doesn't get you at the tactical level anything you're looking for. So alignment is, again, organizational cohesion, communication, shared intent, build tribes, not teams. We'll talk about that later on in the talk. And then infrastructure, this is where all my nerds are at: architecture, tooling, SDLC, and process design. I'm not using infrastructure from the sense of servers, which is how I normally think of that, because I've been an engineer for 2 decades. When I see infrastructure, I think of, servers running in Amazon. But instead, what I'm talking about here is how are you underpinning the delivery engine? How are you underpinning these outcomes with actual on the ground process executions, tacticals, right? So linking the strategy of we are an agile shop to the tactics of how you build your backlogs, what are you using to metric, are you doing predictive forecasting, are you thinking about story points, like how are you doing that on the ground? That's what that infrastructure piece states. So these three specific positions, or these three specific pillars or segments of a triangle, if you will, are all extremely important, and they all feed into one another, and without one you can't have the other. So but what happens, just like in the PMP, the iron triangle, what happens if something's out of balance, right? So let's talk about that. First off, if alignment breaks, which again, as we said in the first slide, it's kind of one of the first things that can break. What happens? Teams tend to operate in silos. So what does that mean? What is a symptom of teams operating in silos? This is not the same as organizational design where I have a support system, I have a support org, and that support org manages my legacy systems, and then I have a forward-thinking R&D team, a tiger team that's moving forward and executing. Like each of those different organizations may operate technically in silos because that is sort of the, again, Conway's law, the structure of the organization, the structure of the work produces an organizational structure that aligns to what we're trying to do. And again, that's okay, but we do have to push back against that sometimes and think a little bit outside of the box. One of the big challenges that when alignment breaks is that decisions are centralized in one place, and this is when people tend to suffer from what I call the architect problem, or they'll suffer from top-down leadership. If you're familiar with the cultural continuum, you've got generative culture, pathological culture, and bureaucratic culture. When decisions are centralized, you're looking more to that sort of the right-hand side of the spectrum, where you're heading more towards a pathological culture, where you're thinking about bureaucracy and, well, we can only bless things as an architect, and things can't ever be passed through a team. Like it only has to be made from upon high because this group of people are the best people to make that decision because they're specialists. That's the opposite of what we're seeing today. Martin Fowler recently produced a great article that talks about the sort of functional generalists, specialized generalists, excuse me. Kent Beck has talked about this for a long time, one of my heroes. There's lots of conversations about that it's not about specialization and credentialism anymore. Like it's very good. Specialization and credentialism has a place, right? If you're a PhD in machine learning, you are way smarter than me at machine learning, and I'm going to trust everything you say, more or less. I have a brain, right? I'll vet it. But for the most part, I'm going to trust what you say because you spent 10 years in school learning how all this stuff works. Whereas a guy like me, who's much more of a generalist, and I've worked across 15 to 20 different programming languages, I have an understanding fundamentally of how programming languages work. So you could technically call me, I guess, a pseudo expert in that because I have so much experience with it, and my master's was in programming language design, excuse me. But that doesn't mean that I am strictly a programming language person. It's a general skill that can be applied to lots of different places, and the pattern matching and the problem solving abilities are sort of rolled up at a higher level. So it's important to avoid this centralization, this architect problem where the ivory tower is the only people that can make these decisions. There are some decisions that need to be made by people with expertise. That's totally fine and cool, but every decision should not be made in that way. And you see some modern development organizations align themselves this way, where they'll hire a transactional engineering team, either nearshore, offshore, however, even here in the States, and they simply hire people to push tickets out the door and not think about what they're doing. That's fine if you have a business that supports it, but I've rarely seen innovation come out of teams like that. Teams need to be empowered, and decisions should be decentralized if you want to get the very best out of them, and have a framework in place to check those decisions using intent-based ideas, which we'll talk about in a minute. An initiative tends to go away when alignment is broken. If I don't know why I'm here and what I'm doing, even the most mercenary of humans is going to simply just execute. They're going to do their thing, clock in, clock out, right? And that's not good for any organization that's looking to innovate and drive forward. So infrastructure, when that breaks, there's an entire talk on this. And as a developer, I very much resist the urge to dig into these concepts. But if you don't have good architecture that can't support growth, then delivery slows and your technical debt is going to go through the roof. That word architecture is very, very overloaded term. It can mean anything from the systems architecture and infrastructure architecture you've put in place, to the software development architecture, to the software process, to the how data is pushed from the left-hand side, i.e. your product team, on into your engineering team. And we have an entire series on this that we could do. We've worked with a lot of companies and teams to help them understand what to do when you run into these problems, and we're routinely helping people fix this. I have a few case studies on my website where we talk about how to fix the infrastructure of your engineering team. Again, from the sense of not cloud servers, but from the sense of how does this team deliver outcomes to the business. And a lot of the challenges you find there are just simply broken communication lines or broken organizational lines or broken telemetry or broken expectations. It's all human challenges, right? Very rarely have we found it to be truly a software problem unless you've hired bad software engineers, which is difficult to do in 2025. And finally, when outcomes break, what this means is not what you think, but how are we measuring work, right? In many organizations, be careful if I say this, I'm going to get people throwing rocks at me. Story points are a great way to find out where you're headed, and they aren't bad inherently, but I have seen them weaponized and I've seen them used to measure outcomes when in fact they don't do so unless your team is specifically and acutely aware of how to map those story points back to the PBIs, right? Or the shippable product unit. You know, again, if anyone watching has had Scrum training, you know what a shippable product unit is. That is the golden calf of story design. Is that this group of stories, perhaps this epic, whatever you want to call it, will produce value for the business. And this is where I see a lot of teams get wrapped around the axle because we get so deep down in the tacticals, and you have very strategic and tactical product owners who are looking only at moving points across the board instead of moving value into the market. And I'll say that again, if you're simply moving points across the board, you're missing the entire point of a good software development lifecycle, which is to move value into the market. Resist that urge, right? Focus instead on, is what we're putting out in fact getting a lift to my organization? And there are many ways to justify that, and it's the product team, as part of a good product team will do, is they'll figure out how to justify what they're doing and align it back to business goals. And you as executive leadership, if you're watching this, if you hold your team accountable to this, you're going to see much better business outcomes, and you're going to see your engineering team shift to being more feature driven and less ticket takers, right? Because ticket takers will produce things, but then often what I've seen is those ticket takers are held accountable to value not being shipped. In reality, that's executive leadership's problem. It's not the team's problem to sit there and say, oh well, you know, we don't know, we need to ship these features because that's what I was told to do. Like instead, we should be thinking as a group, as a unit, as a tribe. How does this give us a lift as a team? So let's talk about what works. Like, how do we empower each of these specific ideas, right? I think one of the things we discussed earlier is this idea of trust but verify, right? It's very important to ensure that you are trusting your teams, but you're also verifying that they are in alignment back to the telemetry that you care about. And this gets a little bit dicey at times. You can build some very specific, healthy tension between teams with this. And I don't have a problem with healthy tension at all. I think it's good. I think it builds trust between relationships. It builds a little bit of friendly competitiveness. But you need to empower those teams to as close to the work as possible to execute, to get things done. Don't hold them accountable and then hamstring their capabilities by saying, well, you have to do everything inside this box or this paper bag that I'm handing you. You want to empower them to go do the things. And this is, I'm acutely aware of this as an ex-developer, having worked across multiple client engagements. These outcomes will happen when we're empowered to go and do what we need to do, which means if I see a DevOps problem or an infrastructure problem, or I see a delivery problem, or I see we're using Git flow and we have 15 feature branches and 15 levels of different environment branches when only 2 would do, those types of things will empower and accelerate your delivery and thus get you to the outcomes more quickly because you're letting the team self-regulate and self-govern. A lot of people get into empire building mode when they're doing this. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble. But in empire building mode, you only care about the sprawl of your empire and less about the outcome of the wars you fight. And I think it's more important to think in terms of how can I solve these problems with the minimum amount of effort possible, and how do I empower my teams within the guidelines. It's important to have guidelines and to have rules, because developer anarchy doesn't work. I remember maybe 10 years ago, it was a big thing about developer anarchy, let developers do whatever they want. That works if you have very, very, very good developers and only two or three of them. It doesn't work when you have a scaled organization of hundreds of engineers all delivering against tens of work streams, and these work streams have some form of giant initiatives and or a lot of money behind them from investors or PE firms or board members or whatever, right? You have to have a coordinated attack. You can't go out on the field of battle without a plan and expect to win the war or to expect to even win that specific battle. So it's important to think to allow trust to rule, but also to verify that the teams are running up against the ideas that you care for them to lean against. I have a few case studies on that on our website, but I'll also talk about some in a minute. You want to build systems that support scale. I like to lean into what's best right now. I'm a just-in-time person. If anyone, and if there are any nerds in the room that know what just-in-time compilation is, it's a concept in Java or in other languages where we'll compile that code when we need to, right? Or an interpretive language like Python, it runs the code when it needs to. It doesn't do any sort of ahead of the game steps. I think it's important to think in terms of that for process. We as a company, Seven Factor, I have made a purposeful choice that we are strictly a just-in-time process company. Has that bitten me? Absolutely, it's bitten me. It's not. There is no free lunch, right? It's not the be-all, end-all solution to every problem that comes across my doorstep. But I have found that with a culture of trust, building processes just when you need them tends to produce the right process for that time. Now, is it the right process for when you scale by 15 people? Maybe not, but that's when you change it, right? And it's a lot of work and it sucks when you have to change it, and it causes a lot of pain and suffering in your organization. But it's good because it allows us to adapt the process right then and there for when we need to adapt the process. This doesn't work in giant organizations that have change boards and other things, especially if you're under any form of compliance framework. You do have to do the upfront work, and that's totally fine. But where you can do this, I would recommend to look into just-in-time process building. And also, don't become dogmatic on your existing process. We have a saying at Seven Factor: if it sucks, we stop doing it. A little bit crude, but at the end of the day, it has made us a better company, because every time we run into a challenge or we get pushback from our employee population that, hey, that thing that you did was dumb, and let's say we get a 70% pushback against it, it's gone. That process will no longer be implemented as quickly as we can find an alternative, or maybe we don't need the process altogether. You'll have a subset, maybe 5%, 10% of your company that will never like anything that you do. I even have that, and I love those people anyway, and I will try to win their trust as we continue. But you always have sort of those sort of naturally negative detractor type people in your company, and it is what it is. You do the best you can, and you put the best fit process in place. You're trying to run best fit because you're not trying to map it perfectly. You're trying to run a best fit approach where I get the best fit for 85% of my employee base or 85% of my engineering teams. And that produces good results, because 85% of your engineering teams that are happy and that are producing are going to get you much, much better outcomes than just having a process in place because you need to cater to the lowest common denominator. So one of the things that we've seen is consistently is that these types of sustainable outcomes, they typically emerge when empowered teams are paired with enabling systems and a clear definition of success. So let's talk about definition of success. We've covered the first two. Aligning your work to outcomes and not vanity metrics. Again, this is going to get me in trouble. I have a lot of opinions on vanity metrics. I'm not here to give you an alternative, because a lot of the times that's a perfectly fair statement is, okay, wise guy, what's the alternative to me doing this thing? I think that thought process is a trap a little bit, because I think that thought process walks you into, well, it's sort of confirmation bias that, oh, well, there's nothing better, so that's what I'm going to do. I think that's maybe a bit close-minded, but I will say that thinking about ways to align work to your outcomes and not just to your vanity metrics like your velocity points or however you decide to do that. Even DORA metrics, which I think are probably some of the better productivity metrics out there, have some challenges. They can be weaponized, but they can also be wrong. And this is why, again, when we talk about AI, there's some question marks about, is AI truly giving us this 40% increase that Chase is saying it is? It's not. It's more like 1 or 2% per my friend Abhi Noda, who has done a lot of work on with some of the Google researchers around Dora and how AI impacts different segments of engineering. It's a fantastic tool. I used it to develop this presentation. As a matter of fact, I have no shame. I use ChatGPT and it's awesome. It has force multiplied my capabilities by probably 100% when it comes to thought leadership and executive decision making and collating information. What would normally take me weeks of typing and thinking, I can simply turn on ChatGPT and talk to it for 15 minutes and it summarizes everything. Or take a meeting that I had about a topic and feed it into something like an Otter and get a summary and then talk to the summary. It is amazing for adding huge amounts of velocity to our teams, but it is not a silver bullet and there is no free lunch, right? That still applies here. It's hard to align work to outcomes. It's easy to align work to vanity metrics. It's easy to say I hit my sprint commit for the past 4 months, therefore I'm an amazing manager. And it's hard to say I shipped X features and they produced Y revenue. Um, Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't tie things back to simpler metrics. Telemetry is very important. Whether you're using predictive forecasting, which is my favorite, or you're using story points, or you're unsafe, or you're in whatever, it's important to have some form of metric that you're leaning into. But I will challenge you to think about that metric and what confidence interval do you have that that metric is truly aligning to actual business value, to a lift in subscribers, to an experiment that we push out that produces on the other side some lift in our monthly ARR or something of that nature, or MRR, excuse me. Um, Finally, building tribes, not teams, I think is really kind of the crux of this entire presentation. If I had to say, this is harder than you think it is, because when you build teams, you are putting together groups of human beings, and human beings have all kinds of fun quirks and things that we have to manage on the day to day. But it's very important to create a shared vision across these teams and empower those teams to do the work and give as much authority as you're comfortable to those teams to do the things that they need to do. I like to use the concept of intents. This comes back from way back in the day. David Marquette had this presentation on intent-based leadership and a few books on it. The idea is really good. I've sort of taken it and made it my own a little bit, slightly different than how he describes it. But the concept is simply that I expect everybody on the ground to tell me what they intend to do to solve a problem. Um, this is a little different than the old consulting adage of don't come to me with a problem without a solution, which I think can be a bit toxic. I have no problems with people coming to me with problems because I will happily ideate with them to solve it. But it is in the same vein that if you have a team on the ground and you want them to be successful and you truly delegate power to the team, that trust but verify concept means that we have to have some check valve that they're not going to go off and do something crazy, right? Which has totally happened in my time. People have gone off and build things, and I'm like, wait, why did we even build that? That made no sense. That doesn't even align to business value. So having tight feedback loops across all of your organizations, from UX to product to QA to on into the engineering team, and developing and building this concept of trust but verify, these check valves, and tell me what you intend to do to solve the problem so I can verify that it does align with my strategy. Those ideas will build a tribe of humans that will go out and that will do much, much better work than a team of transactional robot takers that are simply there to knit sweaters or to sew shirts together, right? No offense to people that do that. These are wonderful humans. Every human is wonderful. But the idea is that if you're doing something over and over again, and you've done it so many times, you don't think about it, you can just execute and you don't have to think about what you're doing. But the work is so patterned, right? I think if you're sewing a shirt. Sewing a shirt is the same thing every single time you do it, right? Whereas software is a much different idea. Building a product is a much different in that the sense that you want to be thinking about what you're doing at all points, right? In order to create a team that thinks about what they're doing, they have to be loyal to each other. They have to be loyal to the organization. They have to be loyal to the mission. And in order to make them loyal to the mission, you have to align them, give them clarity, define outcomes, and provide the infrastructure for them to execute against what you're asking them to do. So let's close out with sort of my silly little outcome readiness here. These are questions I think you need to ask yourself, and I would challenge you to write these down or maybe even share them with your subordinates or share them with your teammates or whatever, because this is where I think the rubber meets the road. Number one, do your teams make decisions where the information lives? Right. This is again a very clean and clear uh, message that you should be delegating and trusting and verifying from the teams that they are doing the thing they need to do. Again, you can stand up your own DevOps organizations to build, giant frameworks for people to use. Like that's not the same thing. What I'm saying is that are each of your teams, do they feel empowered that they can make the right call on the ground? Are your systems, speaking of DevOps, architected for autonomy and iteration, or are you suffering from the architect problem? Do you have one or two people in your organization that tell you how to do things? Or do you democratize that again with guidelines? I'm not saying developer anarchy and you let anybody do what they want. You build guidelines, you build high level strategic goals, and you align every decision back to that. This is again where a DevOps team could put together Terraform modules that align exactly on how you want your infrastructure to be treated with the appropriate reviews and controls, as opposed to having one person develop all of the Terraform. You democratize that and you make that an aspect across your entire team, but you control it, right? That's the important piece, is that you control how these things are used, but you allow the teams to consume that. That's hard to do. And it's difficult, but it provides the level of rigor that you need to avoid some disasters in that area. Our outcomes traceable back to business value. Again, I've been building software for 2 decades and I've never seen anyone do this very well. I myself don't do this well. This is hard. This is very hard. And I would argue this is one of the most critical and key things that you can do as an organization, as a business, is talk about how is what we're doing traceable to business value, right? How are my outcomes I'm looking for out the other side of my team in alignment with producing something that the business cares about? And finally, this is my favorite. Can you measure success beyond delivery speed? A lot of people think of delivery speed as the golden calf of an engineering team. You hear it talked about all the time. Well, how fast are they? How many story points are they knocking out? How quickly can they get to a consistent pace, et cetera, et cetera? I would say that last point, how quickly can they get to a consistent pace, is more important to measure than the actual velocity of your engineering team, right? And that's called acceleration. How quickly can a team accelerate is a great metric to look at to understand how well you onboard people. What's the health of your architecture? What's the health of your delivery process? What's the health of your onboarding and your HR systems to getting new engineers spun up? Like how well are those things created? Can across some number of humans, 10, 15, 20, can really give you some insight into how your processes are tooled for scaling, right? And I think I would be remiss to also state that one of the key tenets of my business is we think you can do a lot more with less. I don't have it as a question on here, but I would also say, how are you thinking about AI as a productivity booster? Is it the golden calf where you feel like there's free lunch there and you're going to get a 20x increase on your engineering team? Or is it more of what we know it to be right now? And that is an incredibly powerful tool that needs a lot of training and understanding to use correctly. But it does give you less with more, right? We've always been a less with more company. I've replaced 20-person contracting teams with 4 people and obliterated delivery. So it's all about, again, how strong your teams are, building tribes, creating, respecting Dunbar's number, which is, again, the number of people that you can have meaningful relationships with, respecting Conway's law, and thinking in terms of how do we create business value with this team? How do we get more out of this team? Not by forcing them to work longer hours, but by working smarter and giving them access to more decisions and giving them the power to control their situation instead of being victims of the system itself and not feeling like they're empowered to go out there and execute and solve problems. So that's my talk on scaling outcomes. I hope it's been interesting and useful for folks. It looks like I'm pretty much dead on time at around 38, 39 minutes. If there are any questions, I'd love to take those. Otherwise, I think we'll hang it up. Do we have any questions, Sarah? Are we good?
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat.
Cool.
So yeah, I think we're good. Thanks, Jada. That was very informative. Appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you all. You know where to find us on LinkedIn, also 7factor.io if you want to talk to us. Hit me up. I'm more than happy to talk about this. This is a difficult problem to solve, but we appreciate everyone's attention.
Thank you.
Cool.